Right, without further ado, let's get these legends on the stage. If I could welcome Kevin Fong first, please. So Kevin is a consultant anaesthetist, an anaesthetic lead for major incident planning at University College London Hospitals. He's also an award-winning broadcaster and author. He's a doctor and he flies as part of the Helicopter Emergency Medical Service, which covers the southeast of England. He was also awarded an OBE for services to science, medicine and healthcare in 2019. He also, it's a lot of this, he also holds a degree in astrophysics and aerospace engineering and has worked with NASA's Human Adaptation for Countermeasures Office at Johnson Space Center in Houston. He's a presenter and co-writer of the BBC podcast series 13 Minutes to the Moon. And more recently, the same team that did that podcast series have created a new podcast about the space shuttle called 16 Sunsets. So Kevin is in conversation with Gerry Griffin. So Gerry is BIS Fellow, former Director of the NASA Lyndon B. Johnson Space Center in Houston, and in prior positions at NASA, he served as the Deputy Director of the John F. Kennedy Space Center in Florida and the Hugh F. Dryden, which is now the Neil A. Armstrong Flight Research Center in California. At NASA, he also held the posts of Assistant Administrator for Legislative Affairs, Associate Administrator for External Relations, and Deputy Associate Administrator for Spaceflight Operations. He joined NASA in 1964 as a flight controller in mission control, specializing in guidance, navigation, and control systems for Project Gemini and the early unmanned missions of the Apollo program. Gerry was the lead flight director for Apollo 12, 15, and 17, and his team was scheduled to land four of the six lunar landings, including Apollo 13, which of course didn't land. And Gerry's Gold team was one of the 4 teams who played key roles in the safe return of the astronauts. So now I'm going to hand over to these 2 legends, and thank you very, very much for coming. Enjoy the evening.
I think we all know there's really only one legend on the stage and one failed astronaut. But look, it's such a great honor. And when Vix emailed me quite recently to say, I've got this thing going on, do you want to come and chat with Gerry Griffin? I think I said yes before it even got to the end of the email. I didn't care what forum that would be in. So I've been really lucky. I think this is probably the 4th or the 5th time Gerry and I are meeting in person. We've been to your house 3 times, I think, across the years up in Hill Country in Texas, making a podcast for BBC World Service called 13 Minutes to the Moon, and then once at Rice University where we did a kind of live event, and it's always fantastic. And I just have to say that in the room we have the producer of 13 Minutes to the Moon, Rami Sabar. You're going to have to put your hand up now, Rami, who's just there. So he's sneaking in there. So we didn't ever let Rami come on the trips with us. so he had to come along. In fact, he's met Gerry once before at Rice when we did the live event. So, but look, we're here to talk with Gerry about human space exploration. I think, like many of you in the room, I grew up on the diet of this stuff. My parents used to sit me down and they realized that, this was a thing where the ideas were so big they might drive my imagination. I'm sure it drove many of others. And with Gerry, whenever we used to meet Gerry, it was like, where do you start? Where do you start with just such an epic track through so much of human spaceflight? So what we're going to do tonight is we're going to try and do a bit of chat, then we'll take some questions from you if there are any, and then we'll a little bit more, and then some more questions. It's going to be pretty organic. And the question of where you start with Gerry Griffin has to be at the beginning. That was what I found myself asking on the way here, is how does Gerry become Gerry? And Gerry, before NASA, you're in the military, aren't you?
I am.
And you are training as a navigator on fighter planes.
Right.
Tell me a bit about that. Tell me a bit about that era of flying jet planes, and a little bit about fighter planes back then weren't like they are today. Tell me a bit about all of that.
By the way, before I answer that, this guy has forgotten more space history than most people have ever known, including some flight directors. He has studied it. He knows it. He knows what made it work, where it failed. And as he mentioned, he's been an astronaut candidate and thought you had it made. I thought you had it made at one time.
Well,
yeah, the beginning for me was out of college, and I had a military commitment because I got commissioned out of what we called ROTC. And I wanted to immediately kind of figure out, what am I going to do in these 4 years? I had a 4-year commitment. So I said, I want to fly in fighters, and I want to go fast and have fun and make a lot of noise, burn a lot of jet fuel. So I took the option where I could get to a fighter squadron, and I did. And I was there for 2.5 years. And that actually was in some ways formative of my years in the space business. For one thing, it was very risky. When I first got there, I was 23 years old. We had 2 weapons on the airplane that were nuclear, killed 1.5 tons apiece. And then we had 2 heat-seeking missions of missiles. Besides that, what that did is responsibility at a very young age already. I had this responsibility of saying grace over these sinister air-to-air missiles. When I got to the space business, it was interesting. The 6 flight directors that did Apollo, there were 6 of us. 4 of us had military aviation experience. And maybe we'll get into this later, but the Apollo 1 fire was hard on our young people. And we were the only ones that had been around death in a fighter squadron where your friend was, you had breakfast with your friends and he was gone that afternoon. And you built a scar tissue, you never got over it. But it led me to think that one day we're going to have something happen here that is going to call on that same calmness. You can be sad and you can be shocked, but you've got to get the mission done. And I think that made me easier to understand what we were facing trying to get to the moon.
And you come out of your military career having flown backseat and fast jets, and these are not
yeah.
It didn't do very well very often, and so this is an incredibly risky environment. But you come out of that, and then you go straight to NASA out of that career?
I tried to, but NASA was in the middle of flying Mercury, the first one-person spacecraft. And they were so busy, they said, hold on, we'll talk to you later, but we don't have time to be hiring staff right now, and we've got to get Mercury done. And by the way, I've always thought of Mercury, Gemini, and Apollo as all one program because they were all teaching us how to go to the moon and going to the moon. So I said, okay, what can I do till they finish Mercury? And so I went to Lockheed Missiles and Space Company. I was stationed in California when I was in the military up in what's called Marin County, north of the Golden Gate Bridge. And I moved down to the South Bay Area and went to work for Lockheed Missiles in Space. And what were they doing? They were launching the first satellites into polar orbit that were the spy satellites, because we were right in the heat of the hottest part of the Cold War. So I got in on this. I was an aeronautical engineer. We didn't even have an aerospace curriculum in those days. I didn't know much about space, so it was an on-the-job training of how do you put something in orbit, how do you keep it there, how do you move its orbit around, how do you go higher or lower, and then ultimately, how do you get to the moon? What path do you fly to get there? So that was actually about 1.5 years that I really got a lot out of. When I got to NASA, I had already had a pretty good explanation of how you flew in space. And so, but I got there in 1964. They had just finished writing up the last reports on Mercury. And I got in on the ground floor of Gemini.
And it's a pivotal time because Mercury has been flown out of the Cape Side part of what became Kennedy Space Center. And it's a little mission control. But around that time, mission control is moving from Florida to Texas, and it becomes the beginnings of what we understand of modern mission control today. I'm fascinated about that because this concept of mission control that we take for granted today is really truly formed in the way we understand it in that period. Tell me a bit about why and how they get set up and, how you find your way into it.
What they did on Mercury, Chris Kraft, which I know several of you know who that was the founder of Mission, the father of Mission Control. He was the only flight director in Mercury. They took a group of people at Langley Field where a lot of aviation research had been done, and they had test flights. So they started with the basics of testing airplanes in the atmosphere. And they had communication with the pilots and so forth. But Chris is the one that figured out, okay, now we're going to be going around the Earth, and then we're going to head out for the moon. How do we communicate even with these people, the astronauts? So Chris was the architect of that. And we flew Gemini 3, which was the first manned Gemini, and I've switched between Gemini and Gemini because we called it both. And we really used the Mercury Control Center because Houston wasn't ready. And although we were based in Houston in office spaces all over town, while the center was being finished, we actually didn't have a home, really, a single campus or anything like that. We would fly to the Cape, and we flew GT3 there, which was John Young and Gus Grissom, and which he renamed his spacecraft the Unsinkable Molly Brown because his Mercury sank. And so when he landed after he got out of it.